Donald Trump is not the very stable genius that he has proclaimed to be, or the most cognitively there, as he's described himself. And we know that, and we've talked a lot about it, but there are a lot of groups of people, a lot of the country isn't quite understanding that yet, but more and more people are now understanding it. And I'll play for you some reporting by CNBC, specifically Andrew Ross Sorkin, who's talking about the CEOs that Trump met with and their testimony to him about how horrified they were by his brain during a meeting they had yesterday. And before I play this for you, I will also link below in the description if you're curious about sort of a deep dive into the psychologists, psychiatrists, mental health experts reporting about the deterioration of Trump's brain and how concerning it is. And we touch on a little bit, it's annoying that actually less concerning to these individuals is Biden's normal aging. Much more concerning is Trump's situation cognitively that does impact critical thinking, decision making, unlike what they're observing with Biden, which like I said, was just sort of normal aging stuff. And in a breakfast brief, we recently went over that extensively, so I'll put it in the description below if you're watching on YouTube. But here it is from CNBC.
I will say I was surprised. I spoke to a number of CEOs who I would say walked into the meeting being Trump supporter-ish or thinking that they might be leaning that direction, who said that he was remarkably meandering, could not keep a straight thought, was all over the map, and that they, which may be not surprising, but...
If you appreciate and enjoy the content that we make each day, I would greatly appreciate you for clicking that subscribe button.
Was interesting to me because these were people who I think might have been actually predisposed to him and actually walked out of the room less predisposed to him, actually predisposed to thinking this is not necessarily, as one person said, this may not be any different or better than a Biden thought if you're thinking that way.
And before I play more of what he had to say, again, this is a meeting. You had Tim Apple, as Trump once called him, or Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, and JP Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon in this meeting. So we don't know exactly who of, I think it was 8 CEOs, said this to the CNBC reporter, but they were shocked and horrified to the extent that people who are really predisposed to think that Biden has some problem, again, because of the media landscape we've talked about, who've heard that message over and over and over again. All it took was one meeting with Trump to go, oh no. And for a lot of Americans, even though I do want to argue with people about how a lot of their perception of Biden comes from these deceptions, distortions, and just misunderstanding of the expertise on this, I guess. But that's not even where we have to get people believing that Biden is sharper than Trump. Instead, if we can just make sure people understand that Trump has issues that, again, many of the experts are saying are worse, then at least they can say it's equal, and then Biden's back in the winning camp. Does that make sense? Because Biden obviously has a more stable group around him. He obviously has more stable intentions for what's to come. An unstable, unhinged person, further deteriorated as Trump is, that's something people should really be worried about. Then here's the same CNBC, I should say, reporter on MSNBC this morning.
Andrew, more takeaways from Trump's meeting with business leaders. What was the reception like?
Well, it was interesting. I spoke to a number of the CEOs who were at that meeting yesterday, a number of whom, frankly, had been predisposed to President Trump, in fact, former President Trump. And they walked away from that meeting, I think, a bit disheartened, a bit questioning, I don't want to say his mental fitness, but questioning just how meandering, how in some cases one said to me, he could not keep a thought straight. He would go in one direction and then he'd go in another direction, and that there wasn't really necessarily a through line to the way he spoke or what even he was talking about. At one point, and you described it earlier, he discussed his plans to bring the tax rate down from the corporate tax rate down from 21% to 20%. And apparently at some point in the meeting was asked about why he had chosen 20%. And he said, well, it's a round number. And I think that unto itself had a number of CEOs shaking their head, given that 1% of the total tax burden on the country is actually a huge number in terms of what is needed to support the revenue for this country. So,
two big takeaways. Number one, more people are talking about Trump's cognitive situation than ever before, and that's good. We need people to understand what I was saying before, that even at his best, Trump was not the most stable person, not the most thoughtful person, not the most fit person to be president. But you deteriorate his critical thinking, and that gets even more dangerous. Okay, so that we've talked a lot about. Let's set that to the side. Also, people should focus on what he was promising in this meeting. His message, as we've seen at other events where he'll say, a lot of rich people in this room, I'm going to cut your taxes even more. And then here promising some of the most wealthy and influential Americans that they're the ones who need to have more wealth shoved in their direction. They should be paying less in taxes than they already do. And aside from the authoritarian nightmare that we believe could come of a second Trump term, remember that he is not going to work in the interest of working class Americans. That's what we saw last time with his one major legislative victory, being cutting taxes disproportionately for those at the top of the economic ladder. That's what we would see in a second term, him working in the interest of really himself and his wealthy buddies. And while I think it's fantastic if you've been able to make it and make money, you also should pay a fair amount. And that's something that Trump does not believe. He thinks that right now the focus should be figuring out how to make the powerful more powerful, make the wealthy more wealthy, instead of focusing on uplifting those who need to be uplifted and giving that incredible American opportunity to as many people as we possibly can. And so, yes, you have the authoritarian versus democratic contrast between the campaigns of Trump and Biden, but you also have the pro-working class versus pro-elite class contrast between the two of them. And Biden's policy record has been one of a pro-working class president. Trump's record is quite different. So that should also be a takeaway from this reporting. And again, reminding people over and over again that for some reason, it's not as sexy in the media. Actually, the reason is this. Let me explain it really quickly. Right-wing media is dedicated to 24/7 nonstop propaganda for Trump and for the Republican sort of MAGA contingent. And the journalistic ethics are just lower. That's just the reality. There's a whole history to how it got like that, but that's the reality. And so because of that, to hurt Biden politically, they will deceptively cut and splice and play on loop any bad moments of him. And then ignore any bad moments from Trump. And then mainstream liberal media, of course there are people there who are biased in favor of the Democratic Party. Sure. But they're just higher journalistic ethics, and there's this, especially on networks like CNN, desperate need to avoid the criticism of being too liberal. We've talked to Don Lemon about how, yeah, that's the case. So afraid of the critics saying, oh, you're just another liberal outlet. So then, to prove that's not the case, they'll hyperfixate on the very same stories about Biden and talk about how everyone's freaking out over his age. And maybe he should just drop out. But don't want to be seen as having Trump derangement syndrome, so they won't play on loop the Trump moments. That, again, according to the experts I cited in the Breakfast Brief video that we'll link below, is actually the concerning thing. The only concerning cognitive story, according to these individuals, like John Gardner, is Trump's brain. So that's created a situation where actually more people are concerned with the mental fitness of Biden than Trump in the country because of that unequal media landscape. And that is going to potentially yield a misinformed electorate going into November, which is not what we want. Let me know what you thought of all that in the comments. And if you want to give the Daily Bonus Show, you can do so by clicking that join button below. That helps to support the work we're doing. And like I said, get you access to members only exclusive content.